The fog moved low across the fields near Sandomierz before sunrise, thick enough to swallow entire tanks. Engines rumbled somewhere inside the gray darkness, deep and mechanical, like distant thunder rolling across wet ground. German Tiger crews sat inside steel monsters that weighed more than 50 tons, confident that nothing on the battlefield could truly stop them. Tracks crushed mud beneath enormous road wheels, while radio operators passed calm reports through headphones, crackling with static. To the men inside those Tigers, this was supposed to be another advance, another push east, another day where German armor dominated the battlefield through skill, range, and fear. But hidden beyond the tree lines and shallow ridges, Soviet heavy tanks were already waiting.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
At exactly 6:20 in the morning, on August 13, 1944, the silence shattered. A Soviet 122 mm shell screamed across the fog-covered fields and smashed directly into the front of a German Tiger. The impact exploded through armor plates with a violent burst of steel and fire. Men inside nearby tanks felt the shockwave through their chests before they even understood what had happened. 1 second earlier, the Tiger column had looked unstoppable. The next second, the lead tank was burning, and somewhere beyond the smoke, unseen Soviet as two crews were already loading the next shell. You can almost feel the confusion spreading through the German formation. Tiger crews had faced Soviet armor before. They knew the T-34. They knew the KV-1. But this was different. The explosion was too powerful, too sudden, too violent. Reports immediately flooded German radios. One commander shouted that enemy heavy tanks were hidden near the ridgeline. Another claimed artillery had scored a direct hit. Others could barely understand what they were seeing through the fog and smoke. Then, the second Soviet shell landed. The battlefield near the village of Oględów had suddenly become something far more dangerous than the Germans expected. This was not a random Soviet defense. This was a carefully prepared trap involving some of the Red Army's newest and most dangerous heavy tanks, the IS-2. The men inside those Soviet tanks had spent hours sitting silently before dawn, engines cold, waiting for the exact moment to fire. They understood what was approaching them. German Tigers were feared across Europe. Their thick armor and deadly 88 mm guns had destroyed Allied tanks from France to the Eastern Front. Many Soviet tank crews considered facing Tigers almost suicidal. But by the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union had learned brutal lessons through years of war. They no longer planned to simply survive German armored assaults. They planned to destroy them. The IS-2 heavy tank represented that change. Named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the IS-2 looked massive even beside other tanks. Its thick, sloped armor gave it a brutal shape that looked more like a moving fortress than a vehicle. But the true fear came from its gun. The 122 EMD 25T cannon could fire shells powerful enough to crack German heavy armor apart with terrifying force. The reload was slower than the Tiger's famous 88 EM gun, but when the IS-2 hit something, the result was often catastrophic. German tank crews quickly learned this reality the hard way. Inside one of the advancing Tigers that morning was Oberleutnant Hans Becker, a veteran commander who had already fought through multiple Eastern Front campaigns. He trusted his Tiger completely. Most German crews did. The Tiger had earned its terrifying reputation through years of combat. At long range, it could destroy Soviet tanks before they even came close enough to return fire effectively. German crews relied on superior optics, training, and fire control. Many believed Soviet crews would panic once the Tigers opened fire, but Becker immediately sensed something was wrong. The first destroyed Tiger was not hit from long range. The shell had punched into the front armor at a dangerous angle. That meant the Soviet tank was closer than expected, hidden closer than expected. Before Becker could fully react, another Soviet shell tore through the fog and struck a second German tank farther back in the column. The impact lifted dirt, smoke, and pieces of armor into the air. The radio erupted with overlapping voices demanding target locations. German gunners searched desperately through their sights, but the fog made identification almost impossible. And that was exactly what the Soviets wanted. The Soviet commander overseeing the ambush understood the terrain perfectly. The area around Oględów contained rolling fields, shallow valleys, forests, and small villages that limited visibility. Soviet IS-2 tanks had been carefully concealed in hull-down positions where only parts of their turrets remained exposed. Camouflage nets covered many positions. Engines stayed off until the final moments to avoid detection. For hours, Soviet crews waited in total silence. One Soviet gunner later described hearing German tank engines long before seeing them. The sound slowly grew louder through the morning mist. Every man inside the IS-2 knew what was approaching. Tigers. Some crews tightened gloves around sweaty hands despite the cold air. Others silently checked ammunition one last time. Fear existed inside every tank, but discipline kept them focused. Then came the order to fire. The first salvo changed everything. German formations immediately attempted to deploy into combat positions, but the narrow roads and muddy ground slowed movement. Tigers tried turning toward suspected firing positions, while German infantry scrambled for cover near ditches and tree lines. Yet every movement became dangerous because Soviet shells continued arriving from hidden angles. The 122 mm rounds did not simply penetrate armor. They devastated it. Even near misses could damage tracks, optics, or suspension systems. Direct hits often caused horrifying internal destruction. Some German crews never had time to escape their tanks after impact. The force inside the cramped steel interiors turned fragments of armor into deadly shrapnel moving at extreme speed. Still, the German crews fought back hard. Tiger gunners finally began spotting flashes through the fog. Once targets appeared, the Tigers proved they were still deadly machines. German 88 mm guns roared across the battlefield, sending armor-piercing rounds toward Soviet positions. One IS-2 exploded after a direct hit penetrated near its ammunition storage. Another Soviet tank disappeared behind smoke after its track was destroyed. For several minutes, the battle became pure chaos. Visibility shifted constantly as smoke mixed with morning fog. Tanks appeared suddenly at close range before vanishing again behind terrain or burning wrecks. Infantry units became separated. Radio communication broke down under stress. Both sides struggled to understand the full battlefield situation. But slowly the Germans realized the Soviet ambush was larger than expected. Additional IS-2 tanks opened fire from secondary positions farther across the fields. Soviet anti-tank guns joined the battle from hidden trenches. Artillery shells began landing behind German armor, cutting off movement routes and increasing confusion. The advance that had started with confidence was now collapsing into survival. Becker's Tiger moved carefully toward a low ridge, while his gunner scanned through damaged optics, searching for targets. Inside the tank, temperatures climbed rapidly from engine heat and gunfire. Empty shell casings rolled across the metal floor. Every crew member understood that stopping for too long meant death. Then Becker finally saw one. Roughly 800 meters away, partly hidden behind dirt and brush, and IS-2 turret emerged through smoke. Its enormous gun barrel slowly rotated toward the German position. The Soviet tank looked massive. Becker immediately ordered fire. The Tiger's 88 PME cannon erupted with a deafening blast that shook the entire vehicle. The shell struck near the IS-2's frontal armor, throwing sparks and dirt into the air. But the Soviet heavy tank remained operational. Seconds later, the IS-2 fired back. The Soviet shell crossed the battlefield with terrifying speed and smashed into the ground near Becker's Tiger, blasting mud and debris over the hull. The shockwave rattled every crew member. Becker knew the next hit could destroy them completely. The duel had become personal now. Both tanks maneuvered for better firing angles while crews loaded shells under extreme pressure. German loaders worked fast inside cramped interiors filled with smoke and heat. Soviet loaders struggled with enormous 122 mm ammunition that required strength and coordination under combat conditions. Every second mattered. The Tiger fired again first. This time, the 88 mm shell struck the IS-2 near the turret ring. Smoke burst outward from the Soviet tank as it reversed behind cover. Becker believed he had disabled it, but before he could confirm the kill, another Soviet shell from a different position slammed into a German Panther nearby, setting it ablaze instantly. The battlefield was becoming a nightmare of hidden threats. By midday, destroyed armor littered the fields around Oględów. Burning tanks sent thick black smoke high into the summer sky. Wounded soldiers crawled through muddy ground, searching for cover, while medics worked under artillery fire. German commanders attempted to reorganize surviving units, but Soviet resistance remained fierce. The Red Army was no longer fighting like the desperate force Germany had invaded in 1941. Years of brutal combat had transformed Soviet tactics. By 1944, Soviet armored units coordinated tanks, infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance far more effectively. They used terrain carefully. They prepared layered defenses. They learned how to lure German armor into dangerous positions before striking suddenly with overwhelming force. And the IS-2 gave them a weapon capable of challenging even the feared Tiger. German intelligence had already received reports about the IS-2 earlier in 1944, but many frontline crews still underestimated the threat. Some believed the slower reload speed made the Soviet tank less dangerous overall. Others trusted the Tiger's superior optics and accuracy to win at range, yet combat rarely followed perfect theory. The battle near Oględów proved how quickly battlefield conditions could erase technical advantages. Fog, terrain, surprise, artillery coordination, and hidden positions all favored the Soviets that morning. German crews found themselves reacting instead of controlling the fight. That psychological shift mattered enormously. For years, many German tank crews entered battles expecting superiority. Now they faced an enemy capable of matching them with heavy armor and devastating firepower. Every destroyed Tiger damaged morale beyond the physical loss itself, because Tigers were not supposed to die this easily. Throughout the afternoon, fighting continued across the area. German forces launched repeated attempts to break Soviet positions, while IS-2 tanks shifted locations after firing to avoid counterattacks. Soviet commanders understood that remaining stationary invited destruction from German guns. Mobility and concealment became essential. One Soviet IS-2 commander, Lieutenant Ivan Klemenko, reportedly waited until German tanks closed within closer range before opening fire again. His crew remained hidden behind a tree line while Tigers searched unsuccessfully across open ground. When a German tank finally crossed into view, the IS-2 fired directly into its side armor. The explosion ripped the turret partially loose. Moments like that spread fear rapidly among German crews. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front already demanded extreme mental endurance. Crews lived constantly surrounded by fire, noise, exhaustion, and sudden death. Seeing heavy tanks destroyed violently by enemy fire changed how soldiers viewed the battlefield. Inside many German tanks, confidence slowly became caution. Some crews started moving more carefully between cover positions instead of advancing aggressively. Commanders requested additional reconnaissance before entering exposed areas. Others feared Soviet heavy tanks might appear suddenly from almost any direction. Meanwhile, Soviet crews experienced something different: growing belief. For years they had fought against Tigers that seemed nearly invincible. Now they watched as two shells destroy those same feared machines. The psychological effect worked both ways. Still, the Soviet victory came at a cost, as two crews faced enormous pressure during combat. The heavy ammunition slowed reload speed, especially after long hours of fighting. Tank interiors became brutally hot and filled with smoke residue after repeated firing. German return fire remained deadly. Several Soviet tanks were knocked out during the battle, and casualties among Soviet crews remained severe. No heavy tank on the Eastern Front guaranteed survival. The battlefield itself punished everyone equally. Rain from previous days had turned sections of ground into thick mud that trapped damaged vehicles. Smoke from burning fuel drifted across villages. Broken trees and shell craters covered fields once used for farming. Civilians hiding in nearby areas listened helplessly as armored warfare destroyed everything around them. The Eastern Front consumed entire landscapes. By evening, German forces near Oględów had lost multiple armored vehicles, including several Tigers. Soviet units maintained control over important defensive positions. Although the fighting around the region continued beyond that day, the ambush demonstrated something increasingly clear by late 1944. Germany was losing its armored advantage. The Tiger remained a dangerous tank. Its gun and armor still commanded respect across every battlefield. Experienced German crews could destroy enemy armor at remarkable distances. But the war had changed. Soviet industry produced increasing numbers of modern tanks. Soviet commanders gained experience. Coordination improved. And new heavy tanks like the IS-2 challenged German dominance directly. The balance of fear was shifting. That night, surviving German crews gathered near damaged vehicles under dark skies filled with smoke. Mechanics inspected shattered armor plates, illuminated by weak lantern light. Officers studied maps searching for explanations. Some blamed poor reconnaissance. Others blamed terrain or Soviet artillery coordination. But many soldiers understood a harsher truth. The enemy had evolved. Across Soviet lines, exhausted as two crews finally climbed from their tanks after hours inside cramped steel compartments. Some crews celebrated quietly beside damaged vehicles. Others mourned lost comrades. The smell of burned fuel and cordite still hung in the air while distant artillery echoed across the front. No one there believed the war would end soon. Yet the battle near Oględów remained important because it symbolized a turning point in armored warfare on the Eastern Front. It showed that Soviet heavy armor could successfully ambush and destroy elite German tank formations under the right conditions. It proved the IS-2 was not merely propaganda or theory. It was real, deadly, and increasingly common. German commanders could no longer assume automatic superiority simply because Tigers led the attack. As 1944 continued, Soviet offensives pushed westward with growing momentum. German armored divisions fought desperately to slow the advance, often relying on smaller numbers of increasingly exhausted veteran crews. Fuel shortages, replacement problems, Allied bombing campaigns, and overwhelming Soviet manpower created pressures Germany struggled to overcome. Every lost Tiger became harder to replace. Meanwhile, Soviet factories continued producing tanks in enormous numbers, despite catastrophic wartime losses earlier in the conflict. The Red Army learned how to combine mass production with improving battlefield tactics. IS-2 heavy tanks joined larger armored offensives pushing toward Eastern Europe and eventually Germany itself. The crews inside those tanks understood their role clearly: break fortified positions, destroy enemy armor, support advancing infantry, keep moving west. And wherever German heavy tanks appeared, Soviet IS-2 crews prepared themselves for brutal confrontations. The image of unstoppable tigers rolling confidently across battlefields slowly faded during the final years of the war. They remained feared weapons, but fear alone no longer guaranteed victory. Soviet crews had discovered ways to fight them effectively through ambush tactics, artillery coordination, numerical pressure, and increasingly capable heavy tanks. The battle near Oględów became one example among many proving that reality. When historians later examined armored warfare on the Eastern Front, they often focused on numbers: armor thickness, gun penetration, and production statistics. But inside the actual battles, survival depended on far more human details: fear, visibility, timing, crew coordination, terrain, experience. One hidden tank positioned correctly at the perfect moment could change an entire engagement. That August morning in 1944 proved exactly that. German Tigers advanced believing they controlled the battlefield. Engines roared confidently through the fog, while crews expected another successful assault. Then Soviet IS-2s fired the first salvo. And suddenly, the hunters found themselves trapped inside someone else's kill zone. Even today, photographs from those battles remain haunting. Burned tigers sit motionless beside shattered Soviet armor. Huge guns point silently toward empty fields. Mud covers steel wrecks that once carried entire crews into combat. Looking at those images now, it becomes easier to understand how terrifying those moments truly were. Inside every tank sat young men trying desperately to survive another day. Some had fought since the opening years of the war. Others entered combat for the first time during 1944. Many never escaped the steel machine surrounding them. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front was brutally personal, despite the massive scale of the conflict. Crews fought enclosed within cramped armor, while explosions shook every surface around them. When shells penetrated, survival chances dropped instantly. The Soviet 122 mm gun amplified that danger dramatically. Even German crews who survived hits often described the psychological terror caused by its sheer power. The sound alone became unforgettable for many veterans. A single successful impact could destroy tanks previously considered nearly invulnerable from the front. That changed battlefield behavior permanently. As Soviet forces continued advancing westward through late 1944 and into 1945, German armored units increasingly faced enemies equipped not only with numbers, but with powerful modern heavy tanks capable of direct confrontation. The Eastern Front transformed into a relentless war of attrition Germany could no longer sustain. And somewhere in that long collapse stood mornings like August 13, 1944. Fog drifting over fields, hidden Soviet guns waiting silently, German Tigers advancing with confidence, then sudden fire erupting from unseen positions, steel exploding apart, radios filled with panic, crews searching desperately through smoke for enemies they could barely see, moments where entire assumptions about the war shattered within seconds. The first Soviet salvo near Oględów did more than destroy tanks. It destroyed certainty. And on the Eastern Front, certainty was often the first thing to die.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.